Imagine waking up one morning and feeling nothing. Not peace, not emptiness in the transcendent sense, but a strange, unsettling absence where suffering used to live. The alarm clock sounds. You rise. You move through your routine. But something fundamental has shifted, and you cannot name it. The anxieties that once colonized your thoughts like invasive species have retreated. The rage that burned beneath your skin for years has cooled to ash. The grief that made your chest feel like a burial ground has become something else. Not gone, but transformed into a substance you don't yet recognize. Today, we will explore something profound. 7 signs that you have already passed the most painful test of your soul. And the 7th one is the most powerful of all. It will completely change the way you understand your journey, your wounds, and your inner light. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections are part of this collective exploration. What we are about to discuss may not only help you see your life differently, it may help you finally understand the deeper meaning of your own transformation. Carl Jung believed that the human soul evolves through a process of suffering, integration, and rebirth. He called it individuation, the sacred path of becoming who you truly are. But few realize that this process often hides behind life's most painful experiences. The truth is, the greatest spiritual test of your life rarely announces itself. It comes disguised as loss, chaos, or emptiness. And only after you've survived it do you begin to realize what it was preparing you for. This is not the calm that comes from distraction or denial. This is something older, something earned through a currency you didn't know you were paying. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections are part of this collective exploration. What we are about to discuss may not only help you see your life differently, it may help you finally understand the deeper meaning of your own transformation. Carl Jung believed that the human soul evolves through a process of suffering, integration, and rebirth. He called it individuation, the sacred path of becoming who you truly are. But few realize that this process often hides behind life's most painful experiences. The truth is, the greatest spiritual test of your life rarely announces itself. It comes disguised as loss, chaos, or emptiness. And only after you've survived it do you begin to realize what it was preparing you for. This is not the calm that comes from distraction or denial. This is something older, something earned through a currency you didn't know you were paying. But here's what makes this realization so disorienting. You remember the pain? God, do you remember it? The nights when your own mind felt like a hostile territory. The mornings when getting out of bed required the kind of courage that should earn medals. The slow-motion disaster of watching your life dismantle itself while you stood helpless, a witness to your own unraveling. You remember the isolation that felt like exile, the betrayals that rewired your understanding of trust, the losses that made you question whether anything was ever truly yours to begin with. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But what he didn't explicitly say, what becomes apparent only after you've walked through the fire, is that consciousness doesn't arrive with trumpets and validation. It comes quietly, almost apologetically, wearing the clothes of ordinary Tuesdays. It manifests not as a grand revelation, but as a subtle shift in how you hold your coffee, how you listen to rain, how you respond when life inevitably disappoints you again. The soul's most painful test is never announced. There is no syllabus, no proctor explaining the rules, no clear indication that what's happening to you is actually an initiation and not simply the random cruelty of an indifferent universe. You don't receive a certificate of completion. You don't graduate with honors. You simply wake up one day and realize that the war is over, and you're still standing, and somehow, impossibly, you're grateful for the scars. But how do you know? How do you distinguish between genuine transformation and the numb resignation that comes from being beaten down by circumstance? How do you tell the difference between wisdom and exhaustion, between enlightenment and emotional calcification? This is the question that haunts everyone who has suffered deeply. Was it meaningful, or was it merely painful? The answer lies not in what happened to you, but in what happened within you while it was occurring. There are signs, subtle, easily overlooked markers that indicate you've passed through something sacred rather than simply endured something terrible. 7 specific transformations that only occur when a soul has been tested at depths most people never reach and has emerged not broken, but remade. And the seventh sign, the final, most powerful indicator, will fundamentally alter how you understand every moment of suffering you've ever experienced. It will show you why it had to happen exactly as it did, and what you've become because of it. But we cannot rush there. Understanding requires that we first examine what actually occurred in the darkness before you knew you would survive it. The problem begins with a lie we've all been taught, that pain is the opposite of growth, that suffering is a deviation from the path rather than the path itself. We live in a civilization obsessed with comfort, with the elimination of discomfort, with the fantasy that a life well lived is one unmarred by crisis. We medicate, distract, and optimize ourselves away from anything that feels like dissent, and in doing so, we've lost the ancient understanding that the soul doesn't evolve in the light, it evolves in the dark. Jung understood this with a clarity that still unsettles modern psychology. He spoke of the night sea journey, that terrifying passage through the unconscious where everything you thought you were dissolves into shadow. In myth, the hero doesn't become heroic by avoiding the dragon, he becomes heroic by entering its lair. But our contemporary mythology tells a different story. It promises that if you think positively enough, manifest diligently enough, and perform the right rituals of self-care, you can bypass the underworld entirely. This is the hidden problem. We've been conditioned to view our darkest moments as failures rather than initiations. When your life falls apart, when relationships crumble, when the identity you've built reveals itself as a costume you've been wearing, the culture tells you that you've done something wrong, that you weren't spiritual enough, weren't resilient enough, weren't manifesting correctly. And so you add shame to suffering, guilt to grief, self-blame to betrayal. Nietzsche saw through this comfortable delusion. He wrote that you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. But we've been taught to fear chaos, to pathologize it, to treat it as an enemy to be conquered rather than a force to be metabolized. The psychiatric establishment, with its diagnostic manuals and chemical interventions, often views psychological crisis as malfunction rather than transformation. And yes, there is genuine mental illness that requires treatment, but there is also sacred disintegration, the necessary falling apart that precedes profound becoming. Schopenhauer went even further, suggesting that suffering is not incidental to existence, but fundamental to it. He argued that the will, that blind, driving force at the heart of life, generates suffering as naturally as fire generates heat. To be alive is to want, and to want is to suffer in the gap between desire and fulfillment. But here's where his philosophy becomes unexpectedly liberating. If suffering is intrinsic to existence, then your pain is not evidence of your failure, it's evidence of your aliveness. The soul's painful test operates in this liminal space between psychological breakdown and spiritual breakthrough. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered that meaning could be found even in the most horrific suffering, not because the suffering was good, but because the human spirit possesses an almost supernatural capacity to transform poison into medicine. He called this tragic optimism, the ability to say yes to life in spite of everything. But here's what the culture doesn't tell you. This transformation is not gentle. It's not a peaceful meditation retreat or an inspiring TED Talk. It's brutal. It's the ego's death by 1,000 cuts. It's watching everything you thought made you lovable, successful, and worthy burn down to foundation. And in that burning, something ancient and true is revealed, the part of you that existed before you learned to perform, before you constructed the elaborate defense mechanisms that kept you safe but small. Jung called this the process of individuation, the lifelong work of becoming who you actually are beneath the masks, beneath the conditioning, beneath the survival strategies you adopted when you were too young to know you were adopting them. And the crucial, often missed insight is this. Individuation doesn't happen through affirmations and vision boards. It happens through crisis. It happens when life strips away everything false until only truth remains. The hidden force that shapes this process is what Jung termed the shadow. All the parts of yourself you've disowned, denied, and projected onto others. Your rage, your greed, your capacity for cruelty, your unmet needs, your secret shame. These rejected fragments don't disappear. They accumulate in the basement of your psyche, growing more powerful in darkness. And eventually, life arranges circumstances that force you to meet them face to face. This is why your painful test often involves betrayal, abandonment, or loss. These experiences crack you open in ways that success and comfort never could. They force you into encounter with the parts of yourself you've been running from. The person who betrayed you becomes a mirror showing you where you betrayed yourself. The relationship that ended reveals the ways you abandoned your own needs. The career that collapsed exposes the identity you built on foundations of approval rather than authenticity. Most people, when faced with this encounter, retreat. They blame others. They numb themselves. They rebuild the same structure that just collapsed, perhaps with different materials but the same blueprint. But those who pass the soul's test do something radical. They stay in the fire. They resist the impulse to escape into new distractions, new relationships, new achievements. They sit with the unbearable and let it speak. What happens when you fail to recognize that your suffering was sacred? What becomes of a soul that endures the fire but never allows the transformation? The consequences are invisible at first, accumulating like interest on a debt you didn't know you owed. You survive. Yes, but survival is not the same as evolution. And the difference between the two shapes everything that follows. The first unseen consequence is what psychologists call repetition compulsion. The eerie tendency to recreate the same painful patterns over and over, as if following a script you can't remember writing. You leave one toxic relationship and find yourself in another that feels hauntingly familiar. You escape one soul-crushing job only to discover that the new one demands the same sacrifices. Different faces, different cities, different circumstances, but the same underlying wound keeps announcing itself through your choices. Freud noticed this pattern and concluded that humans possess an unconscious drive to repeat traumatic experiences, as if the psyche is trying to master what it couldn't control the first time. But Jung saw something deeper. The repetition isn't random. It's the unconscious mind's desperate attempt to bring unintegrated material into consciousness. Your soul keeps arranging the same lesson because you haven't learned what it's trying to teach you. The test keeps returning in new forms until you finally pass it. This is why some people spend entire lifetimes in suffering without ever transforming. They accumulate pain like possessions, storing it in the body as chronic tension, in the mind as looping narratives of victimhood, in their relationships as patterns of push and pull. They become archaeologists of their own trauma, endlessly excavating the past but never integrating its lessons. They can tell you in intricate detail about every betrayal, every disappointment, every injustice, but they cannot tell you what these experiences revealed about themselves. The cognitive bias at work here is called the fundamental attribution error. When others hurt us, we attribute it to their character. They are cruel. They are selfish. They are broken. When we hurt others, we attribute it to circumstances we were stressed. We didn't know. We had no choice. This asymmetry keeps us locked in a prison of our own perception, where we remain forever the innocent victim of other people's darkness, never recognizing our own shadow's participation in the dance. Neuroscience reveals another layer of this trap. Trauma literally rewires the brain, strengthening neural pathways associated with threat detection while weakening those associated with safety and connection. The amygdala becomes hypervigilant, scanning every situation for signs of danger. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and emotional regulation, gets overridden by survival instincts. You begin to live in a perpetual state of bracing for impact, and this physiological state becomes your baseline normal. But here's the insidious part. This hypervigilance feels like wisdom. You tell yourself you're just being realistic, just protecting yourself from being hurt again. You mistake your trauma response for insight, your inability to trust for discernment, and gradually, you construct an entire worldview around your wounds, a philosophy of cynicism disguised as sophistication, a spirituality of self-protection masquerading as boundaries. Cultural conditioning reinforces this trap. We live in a society that valorizes the survivor who never lets them see you cry, who doesn't let anyone get too close, who learned their lesson about trusting people. We celebrate hardness as strength, emotional unavailability as independence, the refusal to be vulnerable as having high standards. We've created an entire aesthetic around being damaged but functional, wounded but still performing, traumatized but too proud to show it. The consequence of this armoring is a life half-lived. You achieve things, yes. You maintain relationships, yes. But there's a quality missing, a depth of presence, an openness to experience, a willingness to be moved by beauty or devastated by loss. You become efficient at avoiding pain, which also means you become efficient at avoiding joy. Because the heart doesn't discriminate when you close it to suffering, you also close it to wonder. Sartre understood this when he wrote about bad faith, the human tendency to deny our own freedom by pretending we have no choice. You tell yourself you can't trust anyone because of what happened. You tell yourself you can't pursue your dreams because you've already failed before. You tell yourself you're just being realistic, just managing expectations, just protecting yourself. But what you're really doing is choosing the familiar prison of your wounds over the terrifying freedom of your healing. The spiritual consequence is even more profound. When you refuse to integrate your pain, you lose access to the very wisdom it was trying to deliver. Every unmetabolized trauma becomes a barrier between you and your authentic self. Every unexamined wound becomes a lens that distorts your perception of reality. You don't see people as they are, you see them through the filter of who hurt you. You don't experience the present moment. You experience a palimpsest, where past betrayals bleed through every new encounter. And perhaps most tragically, you lose your capacity for genuine compassion. Not the performative kind, not the abstract sympathy for distant suffering, but the raw, uncomfortable empathy that comes from recognizing yourself in another person's struggle. When you haven't faced your own shadow, you can't hold space for anyone else's. When you haven't forgiven your own darkness, you can't extend grace to others. You become a judge rather than a witness, a critic rather than a companion. This is the ultimate unseen consequence. You remain spiritually young, regardless of your chronological age. You collect decades of experience but never extract their essence. You survive crisis after crisis but never allow crisis to be your teacher. And so you arrive at the end of your life with a resume full of endurance but a soul that never quite woke up. But there is another way, a path that only reveals itself to those willing to stop running from their pain and start learning its language. The rebellion begins not with action, but with a single heretical thought. What if everything that broke you was actually breaking you open? This is not positive thinking. This is not the shallow optimism that pretends suffering doesn't hurt or that everything happens for a reason in some predetermined cosmic plan. This is something far more radical, the willingness to see your pain as raw material rather than final verdict, to approach your wounds not as evidence of your brokenness, but as invitations to a depth of being you could never access through comfort alone. The first act of rebellion is to stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to show me about myself?" This question reverses the entire orientation of suffering. You are no longer a passive victim of circumstance, but an active participant in your own becoming. The shift is subtle but seismic. It doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms your relationship to it. Jung discovered this principle through his own descent into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. After his break with Freud, he fell into a period of profound psychological crisis, experiencing visions and voices that could have easily been diagnosed as psychosis. But instead of running from these experiences or medicating them away, he did something unprecedented. He engaged with them. He dialogued with the figures that emerged from his unconscious. He painted them, wrote about them, allowed them to speak. What he discovered through this process became the foundation of his entire psychology. The psyche is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be engaged. Your symptoms are not malfunctions, they are messages. Your breakdowns are not endings, they are beginnings disguised as catastrophes. The soul speaks in the language of crisis because crisis is the only force powerful enough to penetrate the ego's defenses. So the practical rebellion begins with listening, not to the voice that tells you what you should do, what others expect, what would keep you safe, but to the quieter voice beneath the noise, the one that speaks in dreams, in body sensations, in the strange synchronicities that occur when you're paying attention. This voice doesn't offer comfort, it offers truth. And truth, as every spiritual tradition knows, is often uncomfortable before it becomes liberating. The second act of rebellion is radical honesty with yourself. This means taking inventory of the stories you've been telling about your life and asking, are these stories freeing me or imprisoning me? Are they helping me grow or keeping me stuck? Most people carry narratives that were accurate once but have calcified into identity. I'm someone who was abandoned, so I can't trust. I'm someone who failed, so I'm not capable. I'm someone who was hurt, so I must protect myself at all costs. These stories felt true in the moment they formed, but they were survival strategies, not eternal truths. The rebellion is recognizing that you are not your story. You are the consciousness that can observe the story, which means you have the power to revise it. Nietzsche called this the ability to revalue all values, to take the moral framework you've inherited and interrogate whether it actually serves your becoming or merely keeps you compliant with others. Expectations. What if the failure that defined you was actually your first act of authenticity? What if the betrayal that destroyed you was the universe removing someone who could never meet you at your depth? What if your loneliness was not rejection but preparation for a different quality of connection? The third act of rebellion is to reclaim your shadow. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive and transformative practice Jung offered. Your shadow contains everything you've disowned about yourself, not just the ugly parts, but also your power, your creativity, your wild authenticity. In trying to be acceptable, you've amputated essential parts of yourself. In trying to be good, you've exiled your complexity. The practice is simple but confronting. Notice what you judge most harshly in others. That judgment is almost always a projection of something you've rejected in yourself. The person whose confidence irritates you might be showing you the self-assurance you've suppressed. The individual whose messiness bothers you might be reflecting the spontaneity you've disciplined out of yourself. The people who trigger you are your teachers, showing you exactly where your disowned material lives. When you reclaim these projections, something extraordinary happens. You become whole. Not perfect whole. You integrate the full spectrum of your humanity, which means you can finally stop performing and start being. You no longer need to maintain the exhausting facade of having it all together because you've made peace with your own complexity. History offers us examples of individuals who underwent this rebellion and emerged transformed. Tolstoy, at the height of his fame and success, fell into a suicidal depression that forced him to question everything he'd built his life upon. Instead of fleeing this crisis, he moved through it, eventually writing A Confession, a brutal examination of the emptiness of achievement without meaning. His crisis didn't destroy him. It redirected him toward a life of authentic spiritual inquiry. Or consider Rumi, the respected Islamic scholar who met a wandering mystic named Shams and was so undone by the encounter that he abandoned his conventional life entirely. His students thought he'd gone mad. His reputation was destroyed. But from that breaking emerged some of the most profound spiritual poetry ever written. He had to lose his identity as a scholar to discover his essence as a mystic. The rebellion, ultimately, is the willingness to die before you die, to let the false self, the one constructed from wounds, expectations, and survival strategies dissolve so that the true self can emerge. This is not comfortable. It feels like failure while it's happening. It looks like chaos from the outside. But it is the only path from survivor to awakened being. You break free not by avoiding the pain, but by going so deeply into it that you reach what lies beneath it, the indestructible essence of who you are, the self that existed before trauma, before conditioning, before the world told you who you should be. That self has been waiting in the darkness, patient and eternal, for you to finally stop running and come home. You've reached the threshold where everything converges, every wound, every lesson, every moment of unbearable darkness. And here, at the culmination of this journey, lies the most profound realization of all. You no longer identify with your wounds, but with the wisdom they revealed. This is the seventh sign, the ultimate proof that you have passed the most painful test of your soul, and it changes everything. For years, perhaps decades, you carried your pain like an identity card. You introduced yourself through your traumas, explained your behavior through your history, justified your limitations through what was done to you. Your wounds became the lens through which you saw the world, the filter that colored every relationship, every opportunity, every possibility. You were the person who was abandoned, who was betrayed, who was broken. Past tense became present identity. But something shifted. Quietly, without fanfare, without a specific moment you could point to, you stopped being your story and started being the consciousness that observed it. You can still remember the pain, God. You remember it with vivid clarity, but it no longer defines the borders of who you are. The memory remains, but the charge has transformed. What once felt like an open wound now feels like sacred scar tissue, proof that you survived something that could have destroyed you. Jung spoke of this as the alchemical opus, the great work of turning lead into gold. The lead was your suffering heavy, toxic, seemingly worthless. The gold is the wisdom, compassion, and depth that suffering forged within you. But here's what most people miss. The transformation doesn't happen by rejecting the lead. It happens by staying in the crucible long enough for the heat to complete its work. You didn't transcend your pain by bypassing it. You transcended it by fully metabolizing it. This is why you can now look at your past self, the one who wept, who raged, who despaired with tenderness instead of shame. You no longer see that version of yourself as weak or broken. You see them as brave beyond measure, enduring what they had to endure so that you could become who you are now. There's a gratitude that emerges here, strange and unexpected. Not gratitude for the pain itself, but for what the pain revealed about your capacity to transform poison into medicine. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, pathimathos, learning through suffering. But it's not the suffering itself that teaches, it's what you do with it. Some people accumulate decades of pain and extract nothing but bitterness. Others face a single crisis and emerge with wisdom that illuminates everyone they touch. The difference is not in the severity of what happened, but in the willingness to let it break you open rather than shut you down. When you reach this stage of integration, something extraordinary happens in your consciousness. You begin to perceive reality through a dual lens, simultaneously seeing the surface narrative of events and the deeper archetypal patterns beneath them. A betrayal is still a betrayal, painful and real, but you also see it as the universe removing someone whose frequency no longer matched yours. A failure is still disappointing, but you also recognize it as redirection, as the closing of a door that would have led you away from your authentic path. This doesn't mean you become passive or fatalistic. Quite the opposite. You become more discerning, more intentional, more alive. But you stop wrestling with reality. You stop demanding that life conform to your expectations and start dancing with what is. Jung called this participation mystique, a state of consciousness where the boundaries between self and world become porous, where you experience yourself not as separate from existence, but as an expression of it. The wisdom that emerges from integrated suffering carries a specific quality. It's not theoretical or abstract. It's embodied, cellular, undeniable. Certain truths now, the way you know fire is hot, not because someone told you, but because you've been burned and emerged, understanding something that cannot be taught, only experienced. For instance, that you cannot control other people, no matter how much you love them or how clearly you see their potential. You've learned this not through a book or a seminar, but through the excruciating experience of watching someone you cared about make choices that hurt both of you, and realizing that your attempts to save them were actually attempts to avoid your own helplessness. You know that authenticity is more valuable than approval because you've lived the alternative. You've contorted yourself into shapes that pleased others. You've silenced your truth to keep the peace. You've abandoned your needs to maintain relationships. And you've discovered that the cost of such betrayals of self is far higher than the temporary discomfort of disappointing someone. You know that nothing lasts, not pain, not pleasure, not relationships, not circumstances. You've watched the impermanence of all things with your own eyes. And paradoxically, this knowledge doesn't make you nihilistic or detached. It makes you more present, more appreciative, more capable of savoring beauty without clinging to it, of feeling grief without being destroyed by it. This wisdom also transforms your relationship with others. Your compassion deepens exponentially. Not because you've decided to be more compassionate, but because you genuinely see the invisible battles everyone is fighting. You recognize the shadow material in others because you've faced your own. You can hold space for someone's anger without taking it personally because you know it's not really about you. It's about their unintegrated pain-seeking expression. You become what Jung called a wounded healer. Someone whose scars have become their credentials, whose suffering has become their medicine for others. Not because you preach or advise, but simply because your presence carries a frequency that gives others permission to be authentically human. In your company, people drop their masks faster. They confess their struggles more readily. They sense, often without knowing why, that you won't judge them for their complexity. This is not something you orchestrate. It's a natural emanation of having integrated your shadow. When you've made peace with your own darkness, you create a field in which others feel safe enough to acknowledge theirs. Your very existence becomes a form of healing, a living demonstration that it's possible to face the abyss and return with light. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this final realization is the relationship you now have with the present moment. You're no longer haunted by the past or anxious about the future, not because you've suppressed these tendencies, but because you've genuinely understood that this moment right now is the only place where life actually occurs. Everything else is memory or imagination, important in their own ways, but not real in the sense of being alive. You've discovered what the mystics have been trying to tell us for millennia. The kingdom of heaven is within you, available now, not as a future reward, but as a present moment recognition. You don't need to fix yourself, improve yourself, or perfect yourself to access it. You simply need to stop rejecting what is and start inhabiting it fully. This doesn't mean you stop growing or setting intentions. It means you've stopped living in opposition to your current reality. You work with what is rather than demanding it be different. You accept your flaws while still working to transcend them. You embrace your humanity while simultaneously reaching for your divinity. This paradox, holding both acceptance and aspiration, is the mark of mature consciousness. And here's the ultimate truth that reframes everything. Your soul chose this, not in some predetermined fatalistic sense, but in the sense that at the deepest level of your being, you were always moving toward this awakening. Every person who hurt you, every opportunity that fell through, every moment of despair, they were all part of a larger intelligence orchestrating your evolution. This doesn't mean those experiences weren't painful or that the people who harmed you weren't responsible for their actions. It means that your soul has the capacity to use everything, even betrayal and loss, as fuel for transformation. Nothing was wasted. Every tear watered seeds you didn't know you were planting. You are no longer who you were before the fire. That person is gone, dissolved in the flames of your becoming, and what remains is something both ancient and newborn, the eternal essence that existed before your wounding and will exist after your healing. You have remembered yourself. Not the self constructed from achievements and identities, but the self that observes all of this with quiet wonder. This is the ultimate freedom. To be fully human, fully flawed, fully here, and simultaneously to recognize that you are so much more than the story of your humanity. You are the consciousness in which the story unfolds, the awareness that witnesses both suffering and joy with equanimity, the light that was never really extinguished, only temporarily obscured by smoke. The test is complete, not because you've become perfect, but because you've become whole, not because you've transcended suffering, but because you've integrated it so thoroughly that it has become wisdom. You carry your scars now not as shame, but as sacred tattoos, each one telling a story of survival, of transformation, of the soul's relentless drive toward its own awakening. And now, standing on the other side of your darkness, you realize the profound truth. It was never happening to you. It was always happening for you. Every moment of pain was your soul's way of cracking you, open wide enough to hold the light you were always meant to carry. The test was not about enduring suffering. It was about allowing suffering to reveal who you truly are beneath the masks, beneath the wounds, beneath everything you thought made you you. You have passed, and in passing, you have become a beacon for others still walking through their own darkness, proof that the night sea journey has a shore, that the descent into shadow leads to an ascent into light, that every soul who enters the fire can emerge not destroyed, but remade. This is your inheritance. This is your truth. This is who you have always been, finally remembered.